Welcome to another episode of the Type Tools podcast. I'm Jacie and we have our expert Scott here. Today we are talking about cognitive looping and we kind of started this conversation already, so we're just going to jump right in.
Yeah. So we were just talking about, well, first, the topic is cognitive loops and what that means, and we'll get into that. And so before we were recording, we were talking about, can you use cognitive loops as a way of typing people? The answer is you can, but you shouldn't use that as your primary approach. You should use the temperaments and interaction styles. Way more, those are just more reliable. And it's the same reason why you don't use cognitive functions in a vacuum. So he's using TI, so he's a INTP, because that could be an INFJ, that could be an ENFJ on a really thinky day, that could be it could be a lot of types. And so really what you want to do is use interaction styles and temperaments as your primary source of typing. And then you can use, in this case, cognitive loops or functions as a complement. You can be
Mhm.
like, oh, if I got the type right, this should be the type of loop that they do. And we're speaking really abstractly without a lot
Well, I can give
uh,
this specific
clear
example.
information.
So I was recently at an event with a friend who's also into typology, and we met a new friend. And I thought that new friend was an ENFJ. And so knowing that they have TI, I actually pulled out the MBTI tool and had her type herself. So I described the preferences and then she typed herself as an INFJ. And I was like, "Ugh, I'm not sure about that." But then my other friend who's into typology ended up hanging out with her longer. And she said that her cognitive loops seemed more NITI, meaning INFJ, rather than FESE, which would be an ENFJ. So I thought it was interesting how one, a hack for TI people is to get them to type themselves. I'm loving this for myself because I also did this recently with a coworker who I also thought was an INFJ. I just had him type himself. And then two is using the cognitive looping as kind of like a confirmation, especially if you're in between two types and you're just not quite sure if it's an ENFJ or INFJ.
Yeah.
But anyways, a
Uh,
good place to start might be what are cognitive loops?
yeah. So cognitive loops, according to our particular personality theory or system, would be, and this is a real thing. So if you're this type, you will experience this loop. And the way the loop works is you use your first and third function to the exclusion of everything else. And what that's going to look like for an extroverted type, it means you don't use any introverted functions. And if you're an introvert, it means you don't use any extroverted functions. And just for clarification, your second function, if you're an introvert, is an extroverted function. For example, well, since we're talking about the INFJ, we use the INFJ. So you have introverted intuition first, then you have extroverted feeling second. So the second function for an introvert is an extroverted function. And then third, you have introverted thinking. And fourth, you have extroverted sensing. So a cognitive loop would mean to the exclusion of extroverted feeling and extroverted sensing, all you do is, what's a good way to sort of put it into words? It's like combining only over in internal theorizing, which should be like introvert intuition, my path forward, the projection of like you're taking what you're observing in the moment, you're pushing it into the future, and then you're doing this based off of a introverted thinking idea. So you have NI and you have TI. So the way you could look at it again is over analysis paired with internal theorizing. And then you just stay there and you don't leave it. And you just theorize and you overanalyze and you theorize and overanalyze and theorize and overanalyze. And that's a really painful experience because you can't get out of it because all you have is your own logic. You're not talking to anybody. You're just doing your theory and projecting it eternally into the future. There's no way to get out, except there are. There's a way to get out, and the way to get out or to break it is to use your second and fourth function. So that would be, so to break it, you'd use extroverted feeling and extroverted sensing. And the way that might look is talk to someone honestly. So you have to be extroverted if you're breaking an introverted loop. So talk to someone or take sensory action. So the way you might look at it is a lot of times the INFJs will spiral about people's motives. So they'll worry about some extrovert intuitive problem because it's a weaker spot for them. And so if you're spiraling about someone's motives, have a conversation and go on a walk after, right? So talk to the person instead of just having it roll in your mind, go talk to them or talk to someone else and gain other people's perspective on the thing that's occurring and then go do something physical. So a lot of times we'll joke about touching grass for basically the INTJs and the INFJs out there. Go outside, like go for a walk, do something physical, and that might feel awkward or painful or annoying or tedious, but it will get you out of that loop. It will break you free from the thing that's causing the suffering. So go outside and talk to a friend. And that might seem ridiculous because it's so simple, but sometimes when you're in those dark places, it's the last thing you want to do. So and that's INFJ specifically, and there are 15 other types.
Yeah, I was going to say this is relatively newer to me, this concept of cognitive looping. I'm very familiar with my own, which is an NIFI loop, which is like, this is bad, this will always be bad. And I really relate to that because whenever I'm in a dark place, that's really what it is. Like this feeling that I'm currently having, which is usually a negative emotion. My NI is like, it will always be this way. And to your point, I do become really withdrawn when I'm in that loop. One, talking to people is painful. It's actually painful, but it will break me out of it. It just sucks. Can we go through some more examples though?
Yeah, sure. So we could do an ESFP. So that would be SETE. So it's I need to do stuff and need to do it more efficiently. I need to do stuff. And efficiency isn't as important, right? Because the same loop will take place with an ENTJ, which is there. It's more about so TE as your hero function, SE as your child function, and an ENTJ it's do more things efficiently, do more things efficiently, do more. So the priority is getting it done efficiently, and then it's doing more of those things. Whereas with an ESFP, it's just do stuff, go do stuff in, efficiency and go do more stuff and go do more stuff and go. So it's more about like the sensory experience. And so the way that might kind of look, if you wanted to put it in a metaphor, it's like a hamster wheel, and they're just really running really fast on the hamster wheel, just going. Like if someone were to look at you, they'd be like, wow, they're going. But then are they getting anywhere? Right. So the loop then would be broken by asking yourself, do these actions align with my values, FI? And is it taking me somewhere that I want? Is it accomplishing a goal? Right? And that's going to feel awkward, clunky, slow, and bad, right? Because again, that's how you get in the loop. You're only doing the optimistic, easy things for you. And so those first and third functions just crush and the parent function, the second one, which is how you can break out of the loop, pushes you to go inward if you're an extrovert and outward if you're introverted. So again, it's sort of, and I guess you could call it opposite action. You have to do the things that, now again, they're still aligned with your type. So it's not any opposite action. It's a specific kind of opposite action. And in this case, with the ESFP, it's checking in with your identity, with what you value, with what's true and good according to you. And then it's also getting in touch with your personal vision and taking all of that action and aligning it with movement. So this would be like instead of the hamster on the wheel, this is the hamster, figuring out how to get to the attic, or the hamster, finding a new cool spot. And obviously in this case, the hamster isn't stuck in Well, we're going to imagine for metaphor's sake that he's not in an enclosure, that he just has a wheel and he likes his wheel and he does his wheel. But in theory, he could, you know,
He's a free range
go,
hamster.
yeah, right. He's a free range hamster. So that would be ESFP. And then we could pick ENFJ. So ENFJ, their optimistic functions would be extroverted feeling and extroverted sensing. So it kind of has that intensity that you see in the ENTJ or ESFP. Because again, it's if you're doubling down on those extroverted functions, there's going to be a lot of action, there's going to be a lot of movement. And in this case, the orientation for an ENFJ will be pleasing and performing. And by pleasing, I mean making people like you, appreciate you, doing things that garner social feedback that's positive. So it's like doing things that other people value. So that might be at work, being a high performer, working crazy hours to make your boss happy. It could be doing that for family members. Essentially, it's just looking outwards to figure out how can I gain validation? How can I be as good as possible according to other people? Because that's what FE is. It's not looking inside to see what's good. It's figuring out what other people around you value. And then extroverted sensing is just doing that. So depending on the value system they're a part of, it could look very different. But yeah, so it's FE, it's like do, be good, perform, and not necessarily checking in. And again, so breaking that loop would be figuring out, like, taking a pause, figuring out what you want, and then also taking a pause and asking yourself if what you're doing makes sense. Is this is this true? Am I being honest in my relationships? Am I not telling the truth? Am I keeping things inside that would make people feel bad? Because again, if you're stuck in a loop, all you're doing is people pleasing.
Mm.
All you're doing. You're not saying the difficult truth. You're not saying the hard thing that people need to know. You're not spending time making sure something makes sense. You're not doing the intellectual work. You're just performing and making sure people are happy, performing and making sure people are happy. So checking in with yourself as an ENFJ again to figure out if it's aligned with what you want, which is introverted intuition, and whether it's true or makes sense to you, which is introverted thinking, and like leaning into those.
So for the introverted types, when you're in an introverted loop, it's about going outside of yourself. And when you're an extroverted type, it's those extroverted loops and it's more about introspection.
Absolutely.
Got it. So we talked about this a little bit at the start, but well, I don't know. We kind of already went over how cognitive loops can help you identify or don't verify a type. Did you have anything else to say about that?
Well, yeah, sure. So let's go back to the original thing. So is she an ENFJ? Is she an INFJ? Right. And now it could, so let's say you were trying to do it to verify a person's type. And you say, well, I've been doing a lot of thinking and I've been doing a lot of trying to figure out what I want. And then you might say, well, that's a loop. You're in a loop. INFJ, you're doing an INFJ loop, an INFJ cognitive loop. Now, so that might be the case. And it kind of just depends on what that looks like and how often you do it. It could be an ENFJ growing and being responsible and developed, or it could be an INFJ just doing what's easy and natural, even if it's ineffective or causing pain and suffering. Because ultimately, usually you want to get out of these loops when they're hurting you. And that's when, right? Because if your life is going great, then you don't actually need to switch things up too much. It's when you overuse them to the exclusion of other things that it becomes a problem. So yeah, going back, there's a good. So again, it's more about a confirmation rather than typing people based off of looping is would be very difficult. Not that it couldn't be done. You just have to be a savant. You'd have to really know the intricacies of what that looked like for every type.
So, curious question. Do you think that cognitive looping is the reason a lot of people seem to encounter the same problems over and over in life? Like, for example, for me, I've had issues with in relationships because when things go bad, I think, well, it's always going to be bad. And I can recognize that might be an IFI loop. For an ENFJ, it might be they get into these patterns of people pleasing, and then when they stop, the other person suddenly doesn't want to be in that relationship anymore because they've become used to the expectation of they're going to be catered to. So would you say it could be like a way to identify where you've been stuck in the past and how you might get out of being one, recognizing the cognitive loop as a way to not continue those patterns, and then two, give yourself the tool to get out of it?
Right, right. And again, we were talking about how difficult it is to get out of it. There's a reason people loop because well, one, these are the two words I would put to it. It's comfortable and familiar and immature. So, right, because wisdom and development comes in learning how to use all the tools, not just the ones you're used to. And then new things will be foreign and uncomfortable. And what's foreign and uncomfortable just depends on which type you are. And you might be in a society that really rewards you looping forever. But at the end of the day, you will get to the point, you will get to the end of yourself. And so invariably, the answer is if you're an ENTJ, make sure you're giving credence to your introverted functions, introverted intuition, and introverted feeling. If you're it, I guess a more holistic way to look at it is it's about making your life better. And the reality is making those shifts will cause ripples in your life and in your relationships. And that's so again, people might avoid doing it because they're like, no, well, it's kind of work. And but from what you said, that this is why people repeat patterns. Yes, it is. Absolutely. It's why people repeat patterns because it's comfortable and you don't develop. It's comfortable and you don't develop. We like being comfortable. I like being comfortable. And in point of fact, in the case of the INTP specifically, like it's not just familiar, it's like actual comfort. So for the INTP, it's TISI. So I'm going to think and I'm going to be comfy and cozy. And I'm going to think and I'm going to be comfy and cozy. And I'm going to think and I'm going to be comfy and cozy. I'm not going to talk to anybody and I'm not going to really mess with anything new or different because that's extrovert intuition and that's extroverted feeling. So when the INTPs avoid those things, they atrophy, their life becomes less full and it's not as good. But they will default to that when, because again, it's comfortable, it's familiar, it's what you're used to, even if it's bad for you, right? How often do people do things that are bad for them? Other people can see it, other people can see it, but you can't see it, or you can see it, but you don't really want to change it because it's hard.
So do you think there's a way you can engage in your second and fourth functions more proactively or preventatively, where you put practices in place? So, for example, if you're, I don't know, I think perhaps intuitive types, like if you found out you had an intuitive kid, it might be helpful to get them in sports early, just so they're using their more concrete functions more earlier on, more quickly, more easily. Like it's just easier for them to access because they're getting those reps in early. Do you think like as adults we could do similar things? Like instead of touching grass when an INFJ is in crisis, could they have some practices in place where they're making touching grass more a part of their routine?
Yeah, absolutely. If I work with an INTP client, invariably they have issues with socialization. And so we just carefully figure out a way to schedule social interaction, right? Because it's familiar, right? At the beginning, it's not familiar, but it will become familiar. And then essentially they now don't have to think about it. It just occurs regularly in their life. And they may not value it, right? Because they're not necessarily thinking about how important socialization, which is why it becomes a problem in the first place. But since it's scheduled and reliable, in the same way that you could have an intuitive child in sports at a young age, and they might, to be clear, hate sports. They might hate it. And so again, you don't necessarily want put them in the best situation where they would learn those skills where they wouldn't also hate it. So I wouldn't say make your INTP or INFP child do nothing but team sports because they would probably die inside. But, get them in a karate class, get them in a dance class, have them make art. All of these engage sensory and tactile skills. And so it's not like one size fits all. It's not like soccer is going to do it for everybody, but there are little things that you could do that would move them in that direction at an early age that would really benefit them later in life. And, as an adult, you can proactively choose that also. So I always recommend, if I'm able, that the highly intuitive types get in, especially if it's men, learn a combat sport or go to the gym. But those aren't the only ways you can develop the sensory. Like you could take an art class, you could, again, take a dancing class, you could go on hikes. These are all things that engage with the physical in ways that are accessible and comfortable and not too terrible for the intuitive types. It's just you have to sort of, if you remember, I have a weakness here, you can slowly shore it up over time.
And that makes more sense to me in terms of the intuitive cognitive, or sorry, the introverted cognitive loops, because it's like go do something is the remedy to it. But how could an extroverted type schedule in something that helps them use their introverted functions?
Sure. It might be journaling, it might be meditation, it might be reading a book, it might be, something like a study session or a book group where the focus is it revolves around an activity that requires introversion. Now, obviously, depending on the type, that might be more or less tolerable. It might just be quiet, reflective time, spend some time by yourself. It might be take a long bath, things that allow you to be alone. And thus, when you're alone, and then, also make it good, also make it a nice thing. So it's not miserable. It doesn't have to be nice. It doesn't have to be easy, but it could be. Yeah. Like if you need to work on introverted sensing, book a massage, treat yourself in a physical way, be more attuned to, check-ins about drinking water or making sure you're like go to a doctor's appointment. Now that might sound terrible, but those would be introverted sensing related, and you can proactively engage in them. I'm worried that this call is going to turn into word salad, and it is super complicated what we're talking about, but there are some core simple things. So basically, it's just remember if you're an extrovert, just remember which functions you have. Just bring it up to the conscious level. So you're not just so you know what you're doing. We're not trying to tell you to be someone you're not. We're trying to remind you that these are the comfortable things and these are the ruts you will get into. And that will eliminate your possibility for growth in ways that would enrich your life. So if you're a TESE ENTJ making tons of money and the world says, money's great, then you're going to be continuously rewarded for looping, right? But at a certain point, you're going to be like, who am I? Who am I outside of my job? I don't even know. And that's the crisis that will emerge later in life when introverted feeling begins to matter more. And so, all that work that you put in, did it bring you closer to what you wanted? You made 50 million widgets, but like, did that generate a future for you that you wanted? And so again, sometimes it's better to have an anti-vision. So what would you like to avoid as opposed to just a regular vision board? Because what I've noticed is people are a lot more motivated by loss prevention than they are getting anything. So they're more worried about losing something than gaining something. So what would you like to avoid? And right. And, that would take some introverted time. You'd have to sit with the question. And so that would be easier for the introverts to do than the extroverts. So the introverts would be like, oh, yeah, I'll think about what I don't want. But if either type did it, they would have a better sense of what they wanted to avoid. And basically, it just gives ownership, autonomy, and awareness to these things that can kind of sneak up on you if you don't pay attention.
Yeah, so it's a matter of kind of identifying what that looks like for you so that when you do end up in that cognitive loop, and then hopefully you can give yourself some tools to get out of it if you're not doing the preventative stuff. And the preventative stuff is really not saying you're never going to get in a cognitive loop, but more of like a you know what to do if you get there. You have those reps, you've done it before. All right, so we went over a lot today about cognitive looping and general strategies to get out of it, but I think it's worthwhile to do a part two to this episode where we go through all 16 types, what their cognitive loop looks like, and how to get out of it specifically if you can't wait. And in the meantime, you want to work with Scott one-on-one, you could always book a session at toolswithscott.com. We'll see you all in the next episode.
Thanks guys for listening. And cognitive loops, it's a pretty intense subject, and certainly, if there's a remedy to rumination or overexertion, it's good to know it's out there. So I hope this is helpful for you guys.